In the spring of 1894, a man in Cherry County, Nebraska, sat down at a table he'd built himself and wrote a letter to a matrimonial agency in Chicago. He did not ask for beauty. He did not ask for youth. He did not ask for a woman who could read or sing or bear him sons. He asked for a woman who was not afraid of hogs. That was all. 14 words, 3 cents postage, and a farm that was already 11 months dead and hadn't noticed yet. 6 weeks later, a woman stepped off the train at Valentine with one carpet bag, a tin box she never opened in front of anybody, and a pale band of skin on a finger where a ring had been. She was not what he ordered. She was worse. She was better. She was the thing that would outlive him by 40 years and put his name on a barn that people still drive out of their way to see, and not one of them, not one, has ever heard the truth about what she did in the pit that November, or what I wrote in my book to save her. I was his neighbor. I hauled her from the depot. I stood up at the wedding because there wasn't anybody else to do it. And I'm the only man alive who knows that the legend of Idalene Marsh begins with a lie. Mine. The sow was dying, and I had my arm in her up to the elbow when I heard the wagon. That's the truth of it, not romance. Not a woman in a doorway with the sun behind her. Me on my knees in April mud with my one good arm inside a Poland china named Queen Bess who had been trying to pharaoh since before dawn, and Emil Voss beside me making a sound I have never heard a grown man make, a sort of low humming, the way you'd hum to a child, except he was humming to a hog. The pig was crossways, I could feel it, a hoof where a snout ought to be, and the sow's belly gone hard as a church door, and Emil's whole year, his whole life, if you want it plain, knotted up inside her. Hal, he said, Hal. I know. Hal, she is my best. I know, Emil. Then the wagon, then the woman. I want to say I looked up. I want to say something passed between us, the way it does in the stories they print in the papers now, the ones with her face in them, the ones that call her the Sandhills Madonna, which would have made her laugh until she coughed. I didn't look up, I couldn't. My arm was inside a hog. What happened was this. I heard boots, not the little quick tapping of a town woman. Boots. Coming across that mud like the mud was a personal insult, and she intended to answer it. Then a voice above me, flat as a skillet, no more feeling in it than a train schedule. Left arm shorter, that's why you can't reach. I said something I won't put in this book. She said move. And she went down on her knees in a gray traveling dress that had cost her somebody's month of wages, right in the muck, and she took off her gloves and she looked at them for 1 second. 1 second, I saw it, the only hesitation she showed me for 2 whole years, and she laid them on a fence post like a woman laying flowers on a grave. Then she put her arm in. She had it out in under a minute, a dead gilt pig, blue cord wrapped twice. She reached back in. Second one came kicking. Third, Emil's humming stopped. He knelt down and started catching them in his shirt, cursing in German, laughing, crying, all 3 at once, a man coming apart and putting himself together with the same set of hands. She got 9 live out of 11. Bess died anyway, about noon, quiet, the way they do, with her ear twitching at flies she couldn't be bothered about any more. The woman stood up. Her dress was ruined to the ribs. She had blood to her shoulder and afterbirth on her boot, and her hair had come down on one side. She said, "Which of you is Voss?" Emil got up, 41 years old, face like a shovel. He was holding a live pig in each hand, and he did not know what to do with them, and he did not know what to do with his face either. He said, "I am Voss." She looked at him for a while, not unkind, just measuring, the way you'd look at a beam before you put weight on it. "I'm Marsh," she said, "Idalene." And Emil Voss, who had not touched another human being since his mother died, who had written to a Chicago agency because I told him to, who wanted a wife the way you want a hired man and hadn't the sense to be ashamed of it. Emil Voss said, "You are not afraid of hogs?" And she said, "No." And that was the courtship. My name is Halloway Quint. Everybody calls me Hal. I ranched 6 sections north of the Voss place on the Snake, which is a river the way a rumor is a conversation. I lost the use of my left arm in '81 under a horse that had opinions. Since then I've kept a book. That's the quirk, and I know it's a quirk because my sister told me so in a letter and underlined it. A tally book. Little green thing, oilcloth cover. I write the weather. I write the price of corn at Valentine and the price of hogs at South Omaha. I write who owes me and who I owe, and I do not mean money only. I write the day a man helps me pull a calf. I write the day he doesn't come when I ask. 40-odd years of it. 31 books in a crate under my bed. I'm telling you this because everything I'm about to say comes out of those books, and one line of them is false, and I'm the one who wrote it, and I'd write it again. I wrote Emil's advertisement. I want that understood before we go further, because people have made him into a brute, and he wasn't a brute. He was a man with 300 words of English and a mortgage. He'd come to me in February, sat in my kitchen and turned his hat around in his hands maybe 200 times, and finally said the Nebraska winter was long and he had begun to talk to the boar. I said, "Talk to me instead." He said, "You are worse company than the boar." So we wrote it. He wanted to put down that he owned 200 acres, and I wouldn't let him because he didn't. The bank owned 200 acres and permitted him to sleep on them. He wanted to put down that he was of good character, and I said no man who has to say so is. He wanted to put down that he required a woman to keep the house and the garden and the hog lot, and I said, "Emil, you're asking for a hired girl and offering her your name in place of wages, and if you write it that way, God will hear you." He thought about it a long time. Then he said, "Then write only that I want a woman who is not afraid of hogs. If she is not afraid of hogs, everything else can be learned." I laughed at him. I laughed at him for a solid minute while he sat there with his hat. 14 words. There is nothing in any of my 31 books that has cost me more sleep than the memory of me laughing. Here is what the Voss place was in April of 1894. 200 acres of sand and bunchgrass, of which perhaps 60 would grow corn in a good year, and there had not been a good year since '91. A soddy with a board front nailed on it like a false tooth. A barn that leaned. 41 hogs, counting the 9 new pigs, which was 41 more than most men in that county had, because most men had sold out. And a note at Sheridan County Savings for $900, due the 1st of November, at 10%, held by a man named Crandall who wore a linen collar in August, and said "my dear fellow" with his mouth, and something quite different with his eyes. 93 had broken the country. You have to understand that. The panic came through the Midwest like a scythe through a wheat field, and it did not care whether you were lazy or industrious. It only cared what you owed. Emil owed. Hogs had gone from $5 a hundredweight to 3 1/4. Corn was a dime. Men were burning corn in their stoves because it was cheaper than coal, and my God, the smell of it, sweet, like something wasted, like a bakery on fire. I can smell it now. Emil had held on because Emil did not know how to do anything else. Idalene Marsh was 34 years old. She'd worked 11 years on the killing floors and the trimming lines at a packing house on Chicago's South Side. And if you want to know what that means, it means she had seen the inside of more hogs than every farmer in Cherry County put together, and she had never once seen a live one until she stepped off that wagon. She knew hogs the way a coroner knows people. She could put her hand on a shoat's shoulder and tell you what it would grade. She could look at Emil's boar, an ill-tempered old thing he called Bishop, for reasons he never explained to me, and say, "He's throwing too much bone and not enough back." And Emil would say, "What is back?" And she would draw it for him in the dirt with a stick. That was the marriage, not the ceremony, the stick in the dirt. The ceremony was on a Tuesday. Circuit preacher, a Methodist named Beale with a cold. Me for a witness. A woman named Hurley who came because she was curious and brought a cake because she was decent. Ida wore the gray dress. She'd washed it and it hadn't come clean and she wore it anyway. And when Beale got to the part about worldly goods, she looked at the hog lot through the door, and I swear on all 31 books, that when she said I will, she was looking at the hogs. She signed the book. I watched her do it. She wrote Idalene Marsh, and her hand stopped, and for a second, just under the surface, something went across her face like a fish going under ice. Then she finished, and I looked at her left hand where it held the pen, and there was a band of skin at the base of that finger paler than the rest, the way it goes when a ring's been worn a long time and taken off in a hurry. I noted it in my book that night, 10 words. I Marsh signed, ring mark left, did not ask. I did not ask. For 2 years I did not ask, and I have wondered ever since whether that was tact or cowardice or the third thing, the thing men like me do best, which is to see and write down and hold our peace and call it minding our business. She changed everything, and she changed it so fast it was like watching a fever break. The first week she walked the hog lot and did not speak to anyone. She put her boot in the muck and lifted it and looked at what came up. She counted the pigs. She counted them again in the evening and got a different number and went out with a lantern and found 2 shoats dead under the feed floor where they'd gone to get out of the wind, and she carried them out herself, one under each arm, and dropped them at Emil's feet. She said, "How long have you been feeding them on the ground?" He said, "Always." She said, "They're eating their own filth. That's why you lose 1 in 5 and think it's God's will. It isn't God, it's you." I was there, I saw Emil's face. You have to know what that costs a man like Emil Voss. 41 years old, come from Pomerania at 19 with nothing but a trade he couldn't use here, and he had built every fence on that place with his hands, and a woman he'd known 9 days stood in his lot and told him he had been killing his own hogs out of ignorance. His jaw went, his hands went, he took 1 step toward her. And she didn't move. She didn't move an inch, and I saw her chin come up half a degree, and something come into her eyes that was not fear at all. It was recognition, like a woman hearing a tune she used to dance to. And Emil stopped, and he looked at his own hands like they belonged to somebody he didn't like, and he turned around and walked out into the pasture and stayed there until dark. He came back with a wagon load of scrap lumber from the old Ferris place 3 miles east, and he built her a raised feed floor by lantern light. And he did not sleep, and in the morning his hands were bleeding, and he had also mended her boot where the sole had come away, and he had done it badly with fence wire, and he set it by the door and never said a word about it. Never once in 2 years did I hear that man apologize with his mouth. He apologized with lumber. He apologized with wire. He apologized with a hog trough he made from a hollowed cottonwood log that took him 9 days, and that is still, so far as I know, standing behind that barn. Now the corn. She wouldn't sell the shoats in June, which is when everyone sold because everyone was broke in June. She said, "They're 80 pounds. Every pound past 80 costs less than the pound before it. You're selling them at the exact point where they start making you money." Emil said, "In November I owe $900. She said, "In November you'll have hogs. In June you'll have $11 and a banknote." Then the rain didn't come. I don't have the words for a Nebraska drought. I've tried in the books. June, hot, no rain, wind SW. July, no rain. August, no rain, corn burnt at 4 leaf, Hurley shipping out. 26 days over 95 degrees. The Sandhills went the color of a lion. The snake got so low you could walk it dry-footed in 3 places, and there were mornings the air smelled like a struck match, and the grasshoppers rose off the road ahead of the wagon in a sheet. The corn made about 9 bushels an acre. You cannot feed 40 hogs on 9 bushels an acre. That's when I learned who Idalene Voss was, and it was not that day at the farrowing, and it was not the day of the pit, either, though that's the one they tell. It was a Sunday in August, and she was standing in a dead cornfield, and she said, "Fine." Just that, fine. Like the drought was a man who had insulted her, and she was going to remember it. She cut the sunflowers on the fence lines and fed them stalk and head. She had Emil dig every pumpkin and squash out of the garden, and she cooked them in a hog kettle and slopped them warm. She went to the Wickham place, where there was a dairy, and she made a bargain for skim milk. The way they were dumping in the creek free, if she'd haul it, and she hauled it herself, 40 gallons a trip, 3 trips a day in that heat, and a hog fed on skim milk and short corn will make you a pound of pork where a hog fed on short corn alone will make you a grave. She went to Valentine and stood in the yard of the packing house there, and talked to a man in her old trade about tankage, which is what's left of the animals nobody wanted, dried and ground. And she bought it by the barrel for almost nothing because nobody in that county had ever fed it, and they thought it was unclean. She got it home. Emil looked in the barrel and gagged. He said, "This is bone and hoof." She said, "This is 50% protein. It is what your hogs are made of. It is what you are made of." Emil crossed himself, which was strange because he was Lutheran, and I've thought about it since, and I believe he wasn't crossing himself against the barrel. I believe he was crossing himself against her. She stood in the middle of the worst drought in that country's history, and she raised the weight of that herd by an average of 31 pounds a head between June and November. I have the numbers, Book 11. She was funny, nobody puts that in. They put in the pit and the burning and the barn and the ribbons, and nobody puts in that Idalene Voss had a dry, terrible, packing house humor that could take the skin off you, and that when a hog knocked Emil flat into the wallow in front of the Hurleys and the Beals and myself, she looked down at him lying there in it and said, "Well, now you match." And Emil laughed, sitting in the mud. He put his head back and laughed like a boy, that great slow German laugh, and he reached up and pulled her in after him, and she came down shrieking and swearing like a stockyard, and for one second, I saw what that marriage might have been in another life, in a country with rain in it. That is the only time I ever saw them touch on purpose. She was afraid of exactly one thing, and it wasn't hogs. A man's raised hand. Not a blow, a raise. September, the Hurley boy threw his arm up to swat a fly by the well, and she went so still and so white that I thought she'd taken sick. And I put it together with the pale ring on her finger and the tin box under her cot that she kept a key to and never opened where a soul could see. And I wrote it in my book, and I told nobody, not then, not for 20 years. 14 words Emil had written, a woman who is not afraid of hogs. He hadn't thought to ask what she was afraid of, or what she was running from, or why a woman with a trade and a wage and a city would answer an advertisement from a bankrupt in the Sandhills, sight unseen, and come 900 miles on a train with one bag. He never asked, and I have come to believe that was the greatest kindness Emil Voss did in his whole life, and that he did it out of pure stupidity, and that God allows that sometimes. November 1st, she loaded 38 hogs at Valentine, and they weighed out at an average of 241 pounds, and hogs had come up to $4.25. She came home with $389. The note was $900. Crandall stood in that soddy with his linen collar and his little polished shoes among the wood chips, and he took the $389 and he wrote a receipt and he said, "My dear fellow," and he extended the remainder 6 months at 12%, which was 5 points over the going rate, and he said it was a favor, and that's the part that eats me. It was a favor. Everybody else got sold out that autumn. The Hurleys went to Iowa. The Ferris place went to weeds. Emil shook his hand. Ida did not. She stood by the stove with her arms folded, and she looked at Crandall the way she'd looked at Bishop the Boar, and Crandall got out of there quicker than he came in. That night Emil sat down and put his face in his hands and said, 6 months. And she said, 6 months is enough. In April I'll have 30 gilts bred to a boar that's worth the name, and by the fall after, this place will be selling breeding stock instead of pork, and no bank in Nebraska will speak to us in that tone again. She said us. I had my book open. I wrote it down. It is the only word in 31 volumes that I ever underlined. Now here's where I have to slow down because if I go fast I'll get through it, and I don't want to get through it. I want to say it right. It was the second week of March, 1895. Thaw, the whole county running with meltwater and the roads bottomless. There was a dispersal sale at the old Ferris place, the bank selling off what the Ferrises left. Emma went alone, because Ida was up 2 nights with a sow and he came back at dusk singing. 6 shoats in the wagon box. Good-looking pigs, red-brown, maybe 90 pounds. He'd got the lot for $11 because nobody had cash and nobody had bid against him, and he was proud of it, prouder than I'd ever seen him. And he stood up in that wagon in the last of the light with his hat off and he called out, "Ida, Ida, come and see what your husband is worth." She came out drying her hands. She looked at the 6 shoats a long time, longer than she needed to. And I saw her go down on one knee in the wagon box and turn one of them over and look at its belly and its ears. And I saw her look up at Emil. And I have spent 30 years trying to find the word for what was in her face, and the closest I have come is this. She looked at him the way you look at a man who has already fallen and doesn't know it yet. She said very quietly, "Emil, where did the Ferrises' hogs die?" And Emil, still smiling, still holding his hat, said, "What?" That night I wrote 3 lines in the book. March 12, thaw, roads bad. Ivas bought 6 shoats, Ferris dispersal, $11 the lot. Ears purple at the tip. The kerosene wouldn't catch, because everything in that country was wet for the first time in 3 years, and I remember thinking that God has a sense of humor, and it is not a good one. Ida had a rag on a stick. Emil had the can. 19 hogs in the pit dead, and 11 more standing in the alley behind the gate waiting to go in, alive, healthy, worth more than every dollar that farm had ever seen, and the 4 bred gilts and the boar. Bishop was screaming. He'd got the smell. Emil said, "Not the gilts." She didn't answer him. He said it louder. "Ida, not the gilts, not Bishop, they are clean." And she said, "For how long?" "Hog cholera, that's the name they used. It isn't cholera, and it never was, but that's the name. And in the 90s it went through the corn belt like fire through a hayloft, and there was nothing a man could do. No serum. No cure. You'd see the ears go purple at the tip and the back arch and the animal wobble and press its head into a corner, and in 5 days you had $100 of dead pork in a pit to dig. It came off those 6 shoats the way you'd expect. 9 days. 9 days from Emil standing up in that wagon with his hat off. She'd known. She knew when she turned that pig over in the wagon box and she put the 6 in the far pen and burned her gloves and washed to the shoulder and lie, and I watched her do everything right. Everything a woman could do in 1895 with no science and no serum and no help, and it did not matter. The wind knew where the far pen was. The birds knew. The mud on Emil's boots knew. The first of Emil's own herd went down on the 21st, 2 more on the 22nd, 6 on the 24th. And on the morning of the 26th, Elias Crandall's man, not Crandall. Crandall never came himself for the dirty part, drove out from Valentine with a buyer named Sipe who had a reputation. And Sipe stood at the fence and looked at the 11 healthy shoats and the 4 bred gilts and Bishop, and he did the arithmetic out loud. $620, cash in hand today. Ship them east tonight on the 1040, before the county quarantine came down, which everybody knew was coming Monday. He said, "They ain't sick, ma'am, look at 'em, bright as buttons." He said, "What a man don't know, ma'am, is between him and the Lord." And it was the truth. That's what I need you to sit with. It was the actual truth. Those animals showed nothing. And half the men in that county did exactly what Sipe was asking. shipped their clean stock ahead of the quarantine and took the cash and slept fine. And the disease went out along the Elkhorn and the loop on the railroads in those cars and killed hogs in 3 states, and not one of those men ever paid $1 or a night's sleep for it. $620 would have cleared the note, would have left change for seed corn. The alternative was a pit and a match and nothing, not a debt reduced, nothing, zero, and the note due in 5 weeks. Emil was standing behind her. And Emil, I want this remembered, Emil Voss, who had nothing else on this earth, who had begged for those gilts an hour before, who was so tired he was swaying. Emil said nothing. He looked at the back of his wife's head and he waited. And Ida said, "Mr. Sipe, do you know what's inside a hog?" Sipe said he supposed he did. She said, "I've had my hands in 11,000 of them. I know what's inside a hog. I know what's inside those hogs, and so do you, and I'm not putting it on a train through Nebraska." Sipe laughed. He said something about a woman's nerves. And she picked up the singletree off the wagon and she held it down along her leg, not raised, just held, and she said, "Get off this place." He got. They killed everything. Emil did the shooting because she asked him to, and because he could, and because he was the sort of man who believed that if a thing is his fault it should be in his hands. 34 animals. He worked from the far pen inward and he did it clean. 1 shot, every one. And he was crying the entire time and never once made a sound, and Bishop last, and Bishop knew, and Bishop came to the gate to meet him like a dog. I helped drag. I had 1 arm and I helped drag. We dug the pit 6 feet because the county man said 6 feet, and we didn't have quicklime, so we used ashes and old salt, and whatever the devil we could find. And it rained, of course it rained. First real rain in 3 years. And it rained on the fire and on us. And it rained on Emil Voss standing in the pit in his shirt sleeves in March pushing bodies apart with a fork so the fire could breathe. He stood in that water most of a day and a night. Nobody could get him out. I put it in the book, March 31, rain 1.4 in, all hogs destroyed v. place, E. Voss will not come out of the pit. He was dead in 19 days. Pneumonia. It went into both lungs and there wasn't a thing to be done, and he was gone on the 19th of April, 1895, at 4 in the morning in the Sadi, and Ida sat with him the whole time and slept in the chair and fed him with a spoon. The last day he was clear for about an hour. He held her wrist. He said something in German I didn't understand, and she didn't either, and he saw that she didn't, and he tried again in English, and what came out was, "The trough, behind the barn, it does not leak." She said, "I know, Emil." He said, 9 days I made it. She said, "I know." And that was the whole of the deathbed of Emil Voss. He never said a word about the farm. He never said a word about what should become of her. He never made a will, and he never spoke a testament, and he did not so much as mention the land. And I know this because I was standing at the foot of the bed with my hat in my hand, and I heard every word that man said on this earth, and it was about a hog trough that does not leak. Crandall began foreclosure on the 11th of May. He wasn't cruel about it. That's what people never believe. He came out with his lawyer and he took off his hat and he said he was sorry for her loss, and he meant it in the small way such men mean things. And then he said the note was due. The security was destroyed. The hogs were the security, you see, and the hogs were ash, and that Mrs. Voss would of course understand. And the lawyer, a young man named Party with a wet mouth, said, assuming, of course, that Mrs. Voss is Mrs. Voss. The room went very quiet. He said, "There's no record at the county of the marriage license being returned. Preacher Beale died in January. Bit of an irregularity. Nothing that can't be cured with a witness, naturally." He looked at me. Because I was the witness, everybody knew it. I stood up at that wedding on a Tuesday in the mud. I said I was there, I'll swear to it. And Party said, "Splendid, and you'd swear the lady was free to marry." And I said I would. She told me that night. She'd sent me to hitch the wagon, and when I came back, she was sitting at Emil's table with the tin box open in front of her, and I had never seen inside it. And inside it was a photograph and a certificate of marriage from Cook County, Illinois, dated 1881, and a folded page from a newspaper and a wedding ring. Jonas Marsh, alive, living that spring on Emerald Avenue in Chicago, a foreman in a rendering plant, married in the eyes of God in Illinois to Idalene Kerrigan of that city, who left him in the winter of 1893 with a broken wrist and $11, and never filed for divorce because divorce cost money and lawyers and courage, and because a woman who files is a woman who can be found. She never divorced him, she never could. Which means the woman who signed the book on a Tuesday in April, in the mud, with a hog under her fingernails, was not Emil Voss's wife. Not in law, not in one letter of it. She was a bigamist, and the marriage was void from the hour it was spoken, and she had no more claim to that 200 acres than the fence posts had. She laid it all out on the table and turned it around to face me. She didn't cry. She never once cried where I could see, that woman, not at the pit and not at the grave. She said, "You keep a book." I said, "I do." She said, "You write in it what's true." I said, "I do." And she said, "Then write what's true." And she got up and went out to the hog lot, which was empty, and stood in it in the dark. I have thought about that sentence for 30 years, and I still don't know what she meant. Because here is what was true. It was true she had no right to that farm. It was true she'd sworn a false oath before a Methodist with a cold. It was true that a man in Chicago had a paper with her name on it. And it was true that Emil Voss died of standing in a pit he stood in because she told him to, and that she told him to because it was right, and that being right cost her $620, a herd, a husband, and every acre she had. It was true that the Hurley's hogs lived. The Wickham dairy lived. The whole east half of that county came through 95 without cholera, and there was exactly one reason for it, and she was standing in an empty hog lot at midnight with nothing. Which of those is true? Tell me. Pick one and I'll write it. On the 22nd of May, 1895, I sat in the office of Sheridan County Savings, and I put my hand on a Bible, and I swore that on his deathbed, in my hearing, Emil Voss declared that everything he possessed was to go to his wife Idalene. He never said it. He said a trough doesn't leak. I swore it in front of Crandall and Party and a notary, and I said it slow, in my own words, in the flat voice of a man who keeps books and doesn't lie, and every man in that room believed me because in 30 years of that country I had never once been known to say a thing that wasn't so. That is the coin I spent. That's the whole of what I had, and I spent it in about 11 seconds. Crandall extended the note 2 years on her personal word. Her word. He said, "I remember it exactly," he said. "Madam, I have watched you burn $600 because it was $600 of other men's disease. I would rather hold your word than another man's collateral." So the lie bought her the meeting, and she bought the rest herself. I've never been confused about which of those mattered. You know the rest. Everybody knows the rest, and that's the strange part, that the loud half of a life is the half that gets known. She started over with 4 bread gilts bought on credit from a Wisconsin man who'd read about the burning in a farm paper and wrote to her, unasked, and put them on a train, and would not take a note for them. She fed skim milk and tankage and clover. She built the raised floors on every pen, and she scalded them twice a year, and she quarantined every animal that came onto that place for 30 days, in a shed by the road, alone, and men laughed at her about that shed for 6 years, and then, one by one, they built their own. She sold breeding stock, not pork. She kept records like a bank, every litter, every weight, every gain per bushel in a hand like copperplate, in ledgers she bought with money she should have spent on shoes. She'd learned that from me, and I have never told a soul. By 1901, The Voss herd was 39 sows and a name in 3 states. By 1907, there was a catalog with a photograph of the barn in it, the barn she built, and Emil's leaning one still standing next to it because she wouldn't let anybody touch it, and the words VOSS Stock Farm, Est 1894, Cherry Co., Nebraska, and men came out from Iowa and Illinois on the train to buy a boar pig from her at a price that would have paid Emil's whole note twice. She kept his name on everything, every catalog, every ribbon, every letterhead, Voss. And every year on the 19th of April she went out and stood by the trough behind the barn, the cottonwood one, the one that took him 9 days. I never asked her what she did out there. I know she never remarried. I know a letter came from Chicago in 1902, and she read it at the table and put it in the stove without a word. And I know Jonas Marsh died in 1911 and she did not go. And I know that after that she could have made herself honest with a courthouse and a fee, and she never did. I never asked her that either. It's the great regret of an old man's life, the questions he minded his business about. They put her in the paper when she died. 1934. Sandhills woman built empire from ruin. There's a photograph, she's about 70, in a barn coat, one hand on a gate and she's not smiling, and her hand on that gate is the biggest thing in the picture. The article says she came west as a bride. The article says her husband taught her the hog business. I read that on my porch with the paper shaking, and I laughed until I had to put my head down on the rail, and my daughter came out and asked me what in the world, and I said, nothing. A man taught her the hog business. 14 words is what he wrote. A woman who is not afraid of hogs. He got what he asked for. That's the joke of it. That's the whole grim joke. He asked for exactly one thing, and God gave him that one thing entire, and it cost him everything he had and made him immortal in a county that can't remember his face. There's a line in Book 11 in my hand, dated the 22nd of May, 1895. Swore at Bankrupt, Voss last words, note extended 2 words. And then, because I could not help myself, because a man who has kept a true book for 30 years cannot simply put a false thing in it and close the cover, 3 more words small at the end of the line, where I thought no one would ever look. He never said, that book is in the crate under my bed with the other 30. Nobody's opened it. Nobody will until I'm gone, and then somebody will, and they'll find that line, and they will not know what to do with it. Neither did I. She's out at the Boole Crossing Cemetery under a stone that says VOSS, next to a stone that says VOSS, and there is not one word on either of them that is entirely.